The rain came down in sheets that November evening, turning the city streets into rivers of neon reflections and forgotten dreams. Sarah Chen stood at the window of her cramped studio apartment, watching strangers below huddle under awnings and sprint between doorways, each one racing toward somewhere warm, somewhere that felt like home. She pressed her forehead against the cold glass and wondered if anyone down there felt as invisible as she did. 28 years old, alone in a city of millions, with a mother she hadn't spoken to in 3 years and a career that had crumbled like wet cardboard. The eviction notice on her kitchen counter gave her 14 days. 14 days to figure out how a life could fall apart so completely, or 14 days to disappear entirely. She wasn't sure which terrified her more. The envelope had arrived that morning, official and unforgiving. Sarah had stared at it for an hour before opening it, as if avoiding the words inside could somehow change their meaning. But reality didn't work that way. She'd learned that lesson over and over this past year when the magazine folded and took her job with it, when her landlord sold the building to developers who wanted to triple the rent, when her credit cards maxed out and her bank account dwindled to double digits. The American dream, she thought bitterly, had become a cruel joke told at her expense. Her phone buzzed. Another message from her mother. Sarah deleted it without reading, just like all the others. Some wounds cut too deep for text messages to heal. The fight 3 years ago hadn't been about anything specific, or maybe it had been about everything. About expectations and disappointments. About the daughter her mother wanted and the woman Sarah had become. About love that felt like pressure and words that couldn't be taken back. Sarah had left her hometown in Ohio and never looked back, building a wall between then and now, between who she was and who she needed to be. Except now, standing in an apartment that wouldn't be hers much longer, Sarah wasn't sure who she needed to be anymore. She grabbed her jacket and headed out into the rain, needing to move, needing to breathe air that didn't taste like failure. The streets of Brooklyn were quieter than usual, the downpour keeping most people inside. Sarah walked without direction, letting her feet choose the path while her mind spun in circles. Past the bodega where the owner always smiled at her, past the park where she used to read on sunny afternoons, past the subway entrance that could take her anywhere but home. That's when she saw her. An elderly woman sat on a bench at the bus stop, completely soaked, clutching a torn plastic bag against her chest. She wore a thin coat that had probably been nice once, decades ago, and shoes that were more holes than leather. Her silver hair hung in wet strands around a face lined with years. Sarah couldn't begin to count. But it was her eyes that stopped Sarah mid-step. They held a clarity, a presence that seemed to see straight through the rain, and the darkness and everything else. "Miss, are you okay?" Sarah heard herself ask, though she barely had enough okay left for herself. The woman looked up, and a smile cracked across her weathered face like sunlight through storm clouds. "Waiting for a bus that should have come an hour ago. But I'm in no hurry, dear. Where would I be rushing to anyway?" Sarah noticed the woman was shivering. Without thinking, she shrugged off her jacket and held it out. "Here, please." "You're freezing." "Oh, I couldn't." "I insist. I'm heading home anyway." The lie came easily because Sarah had nowhere she needed to be and nothing waiting for her when she got there. The woman accepted the jacket with trembling hands, and as she wrapped it around her shoulders, she studied Sarah with those penetrating eyes. "You're carrying something heavy," she said quietly. "I can see it in your face. The weight of the world, or maybe just your corner of it." Sarah laughed, a sound without humor. "Is it that obvious? To someone who's carried her share of weight?" "Yes." The woman patted the wet bench beside her. "Sit with me a minute. Tell me your name, at least." "Sarah." "Margaret." She extended a gnarled hand, and Sarah shook it, feeling the papery skin and surprising strength. "Now, Sarah, I'm going to tell you something, and you're going to think I'm just a crazy old woman. But I need you to listen anyway." "Can you do that?" Sarah nodded, too tired to do anything else. "Every person you meet is fighting a battle you know nothing about," Margaret began, her voice steady despite the cold. "But here's what most people don't realize. Kindness isn't just for the person receiving it. It's medicine for the person giving it too. Changes something inside you. Reminds you that you're still human, still connected to something bigger than your own troubles." Sarah felt her throat tighten. What if your troubles are bigger than you can handle? What if you're drowning and there's no one to throw you a rope? Margaret squeezed her hand. Sometimes we have to be our own rope, dear. And sometimes we find that when we reach out to help someone else, we grab onto something solid ourselves. They sat in silence for a moment, rain hammering the bus shelter roof. Then Margaret reached into her torn plastic bag and pulled out a small notebook, its pages warped from moisture. I keep a list, she said, flipping it open. Every kindness someone shows me, I write it down. Been doing it for 40 years. Since my husband died and I thought I'd drown in loneliness. Look. Sarah leaned over, seeing pages filled with cramped handwriting. Stranger bought my coffee. Young man helped me cross the street. Neighbor brought me soup when I was sick. Hundreds of entries, thousands maybe. Each one a moment when someone saw Margaret and chose kindness. The world is full of more good than bad, Margaret said softly. We just forget to look for it when we're underwater. But it's there, Sarah. Every single day someone chooses to be kind, and that choice matters more than you know. A bus finally appeared in the distance, its lights cutting through the rain. Margaret stood slowly and Sarah stood with her. As the bus pulled up, Margaret pressed the notebook into Sarah's hands. But this is yours. It's starting to run out of pages anyway, Margaret said with a wink. I think you need it more than I do right now. Start your own list. You'll be surprised how quickly it fills up. And Sarah, add one thing to it tonight. A girl gave a stranger her jacket in the rain. Before Sarah could protest, Margaret climbed onto the bus. Through the window, she waved once, and then the bus pulled away, leaving Sarah standing alone with a waterlogged notebook and a feeling she couldn't quite name. She walked home slowly, turning Margaret's words over in her mind. In her apartment, she made tea and sat at her small kitchen table, the eviction notice staring at her from the corner. She opened the notebook to the first blank page and wrote, Met Margaret. Gave away my jacket. She gave me hope. The next morning, Sarah woke with a strange sense of purpose. She couldn't solve her housing problem today or magically fix her career, but she could do something. She walked to a nearby coffee shop and bought 2 coffees, leaving one on the counter with a note. For whoever needs it most today. The barista's confused smile became her second entry. She helped an older man carry his groceries up the stairs. Third entry. She called her former intern, a talented kid struggling to find work, and spent an hour on the phone sharing contacts and advice. Fourth entry. She donated the few clothes she could spare to a local shelter. Fifth entry. The days began to blur together, but differently than before. Sarah still faced the same problems, the eviction notice, the empty bank account, the uncertain future, but now she moved through the world with intention, looking for moments where she could choose kindness. And Margaret was right. Something was changing inside her. The crushing weight of her own troubles didn't disappear, but it shifted, making room for something else, connection, purpose, hope. 2 weeks later, on the day she was supposed to be out of her apartment, Sarah's phone rang from an unknown number. It was the editor of a small online publication. She'd sent her resume to Weeks, Ago, one of dozens of applications she'd fired off into the void. They were starting a new vertical focused on human interest. Stories and community journalism. The pay wasn't great, but it was something. It was a rope. Sarah said yes before the editor finished explaining the position. That evening, she stood at her window one last time, not because she was leaving, but because the landlord had agreed to let her stay another month at her old rate after she wrote him a letter, explaining her situation, not from desperation but from honesty. From one human to another. It wouldn't solve everything, but it bought her time. She pulled out Margaret's notebook, now filled with her own entries. 43 kindnesses in 14 days. 43 moments when she could have turned inward but chose to reach outward instead. 43 tiny lights in the darkness. Her phone buzzed. A message from her mother. Sarah, I know we haven't talked, but I miss you. I'm sorry for everything. Can we try again? For 3 years, Sarah had ignored these messages, letting pride and hurt build walls that seemed impossible to scale. But Margaret's words echoed in her mind. Sometimes we have to be our own rope, and sometimes we find that when we reach out to help someone else, we grab onto something solid. Sarah's fingers hovered over her phone. Then she typed, I miss you too, Mom. I'm sorry too. Yes, let's try. She hit send before she could second-guess herself. The response came within seconds. I love you, honey. Always have. Always will. Can I call you? Yes, Sarah typed back, and when her phone rang, she answered it. Her mother's voice cracked with emotion. Sarah? Hi, Mom. They talked for 2 hours, crying and laughing and stumbling through apologies and explanations. It wasn't perfect, and it didn't fix everything, but it was a beginning. Another rope, another light. 3 months later, Sarah got a message from an unknown number. This is Margaret. The bus driver gave me your number. I wanted to see how you're doing and if you've been filling that notebook. Sarah stared at her phone in disbelief, then laughed until tears streamed down her face. She had so much to tell Margaret. About the job that was turning into a career. About reconciling with her mother. About the apartment she'd finally secured, small but hers. About the notebook she'd filled and the second one she'd started. But most of all, she wanted to tell Margaret thank you. Thank you for seeing her that night in the rain. Thank you for choosing to share wisdom instead of keeping warm. Thank you for reminding her that kindness wasn't weakness, that reaching out wasn't giving up, that sometimes the very act of helping someone else was exactly what you needed to save yourself. Sarah wrote back, the notebook changed my life. Can we meet for coffee? I want to hear about yours. They met the following Saturday at a small cafe in Brooklyn. Margaret arrived in a new coat, her silver hair neatly styled, her eyes still holding that same clarity. They talked for hours. Two souls who'd found each other in a storm and discovered that kindness, however small, had the power to reshape the world. When they parted ways, Sarah pressed a new notebook into Margaret's hands. Start fresh, she said. I have a feeling you've got a lot more kindness to document. Margaret smiled, that same sunlight through storm clouds smile. We both do, dear. We both do. Sarah walked home through the city streets, no longer feeling invisible. She'd learned that healing wasn't linear, that problems didn't vanish overnight, that life would always find new ways to knock you down. But she'd also learned something more important, that kindness was revolutionary, that connection was survival, that choosing to see and help another person was choosing to see and help yourself. She pulled out her phone and added one more entry to her list. Gave Margaret a new notebook. She gave me a new life. And somewhere in the vast web of humanity, in offices and apartments and street corners and bus stops, other people were making their own choices. To smile at a stranger, to hold a door, to listen, to care. Small acts that rippled outward, changing everything and nothing, proving that in a world that often felt too big and too harsh and too lonely, kindness was the thread that held it all together. Sarah looked up at the sky, clear for the first time in weeks, and felt something she hadn't felt in longer than she could remember. She felt grateful. Grateful for eviction notices that forced her into the rain. Grateful for Margaret and bus stops and waterlogged notebooks. Grateful for second chances and new beginnings and the stubborn, beautiful resilience of the human heart. Title her, that nameless elderly woman on a bench. And you title everyone? Whoever chose kindness when it would have been easier to look away. You title every person who ever reached out when they were drowning themselves. You title the quiet heroes who populate our ordinary days, reminding us that we're never as alone as we think, never as hopeless as we feel. Sarah understood that now, and she would spend the rest of her life paying it forward, one small kindness at a time, adding entries to an endless list of proof that humanity, for all its flaws, still knew how to shine.